All right, everyone. Well, it is 4:29, so we can get the ball rolling. Appreciate everyone taking the time out of their afternoon to learn about Venture for America. The title of today's webinar is VFA 101, and from the thread, I see that we have some folks from across, the age spectrum, whether you are a first-year student um, or a junior that's getting a jump start on opportunities headed into your senior year, and some seniors and postgrads as well. Venture for America as a program, you're eligible to apply but during your senior year or up to 3 years after your senior year. And so everybody who's on the call is eligible who has shared their information as far as those who are seniors and above. And for those that are, the class of 2021 or younger, I'm glad that y'all are here because you can think about how we approach entrepreneurship. And VFA is one of many routes to launch one's entrepreneurial career. So I'm glad that we get to connect before your senior year. Like I shared, we are recording this webinar. So I'm going to be sending out a recording at the no later than tomorrow for you all to use as a resource. We're going to have about a 30-minute presentation and then jump into 30 minutes of Q&A. So let's get started. I am from Columbus, Ohio. And when I was in high school, I told my dad I wanted to work at our local grocery store. He told me that I had to start my own business. And I started DJing in high school and hustled my way through high school and college as a DJ. And I share that because, that's like my hustler story. And I know that all of us have some type of hustler story, whether it is launching a side project, working a part-time job, starting something at our university or in our community. There's a lot of different ways that you can find entrepreneurial characteristics in one's background. So I just want to encourage you when applying to VFA and other opportunities to share your story. And so when I was a senior, thinking about what I wanted to do after graduation, I actually studied public policy and I thought about being a K-12 education teacher. Of course, I was looking at established businesses and tech firms, but I was really pumped up about my experience as a DJ and what I was learning outside the classroom. So I applied to Venture for America. I'm thankful that I received an offer to join the class of 2014. I spent my fellowship in New Orleans, where I worked at a startup in the food and beverage industry. I was in a sales role, and of course, our fellowship is 2 years long. I completed my fellowship there, and at the end of my fellowship, I knew that I wanted to continue working in startups. I knew I wanted to stay in New Orleans, and I knew I wanted to continue to learn to sell as a skill set. And so I did so at a second startup in New Orleans. And so, all in all, I was in New Orleans for 4 years, two different startups, always working in sales and business development. Last spring, I wanted to return home to Columbus, which of course is another VFA city, and I joined the VFA team as a recruiter. In my role, I recruit students from across the country, but I do have a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if there's anything in your way, whether it's related to your race, your gender, your socioeconomic status, your sexuality, you're a first generation college student, anything that might be in the way of you becoming a VFA fellow, I hope that you feel like you can reach out to me as a resource, so that we can think about how we can overcome those barriers together, and you can launch your career as a startup leader and entrepreneur with Venture for America. So happy to be there for you all throughout this entire process. And so in today's presentation, we're going to jump into the mission and overview of Venture for America as a program. We're going to talk about Match, which is how you find your job as a VFA fellow. We'll dig into Training Camp, which is our month-long training experience in Detroit, Michigan. We'll talk about life as a VFA fellow, as well as how you can start and launch a business with VFA. And we will dig into a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So first, we will dig into the mission and overview. So I like to read this aloud because it's very important to us as an organization. Venture for America is creating economic opportunity in American cities by mobilizing the next generation of entrepreneurs and equipping them with the skills and resources they need to create jobs. To break this down a little bit, the next generation of entrepreneurs, that is you all. We want to train you, give you the community, give you the network, give you the mentorship, the learning opportunities so that you can become a leader at a startup and or launch your own business. And so as an organization, we are interested in creating an economic opportunity on American cities. Those American cities are these 14 listed here. You'll notice that they're predominantly in the East Coast, in the Midwest, in the Southeast. You'll also notice that the startup hubs are not included in this list. So San Francisco, New York City, Boston, Austin, Atlanta, these are not cities that we currently work in. I'll tell you why. So all of the cities that we do work in and that are on this list have a couple of things in common. First and foremost, they have growing entrepreneurial ecosystems. That's a little jargony. So what that means is they have organizations and businesses in these communities that are building products and services that are solving problems, right? It's not that there's only businesses that are well run and growing in the hubs. A second thing that these cities have in common is that they have a challenge of recruiting the best and brightest to their cities to work in startups. So if a young person thinks startups, they automatically think San Francisco or some of the other cities that I listed. And so that's where VFA comes in. We connect people who want to become leaders at startups, people who want to become founders with startups and founders in these cities with the idea that you can learn from these entrepreneurial leaders over a 2-year period, not only how to develop your skill set, but how to build a business so that you can launch your entrepreneurial career. And as far as our application process, the first thing I like to talk about is eligibility. So like I mentioned, one form of eligibility is in terms of your graduation class. And so to be eligible for the class of 2020, you must have earned your undergraduate degree by spring 2020. So that's next spring, and or graduated with your first undergraduate degree in the spring of 2017 or later. So basically spring of 2017 to spring of 2020 is eligible. If you're older than that age bracket and you want to apply for VFA, please reach out to me and I'll talk about next steps. For those who are younger than that age bracket, appreciate y'all being here because this is a great introduction to get your wheels turning about ways that you can get started and prepare for an entrepreneurial career. The second piece of eligibility is that you must be a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident, and or a DACA recipient. The reason for that is that we will not pay you as Venture for America. The startups will pay you, and so the startups would be required to pay for a work visa should you not qualify for one of those three citizenship statuses that I listed. If you have any questions about your eligibility, please reach out. So there's 4 parts to our application. The first part of the application is the activities section. For those who have just applied to VFA or are thinking about applying, this is where we get a chance to learn who you are. You attach your resume, and this entire round is about impact. So whether you're applying to Venture for America now or you're an underclassman thinking about internships, it's always important to emphasize opportunities where you have had impact, because your employer or potential employer can think about how you can translate those experiences into their job. So it's not required that you've started something to join Venture for America. It's not required that you know how to code. What is required is that you've made an impact on an organization. This could be a club, this could be a job, this could be community work. Think about ways where you have added value to the groups that you've worked with. The second round of the application is the essay portion. And in this portion, there are 2 essential questions. And these questions are really essential to our entire application process. The first is, why is VFA the next best step in your career? And the second is where you practice pitching yourself for a role in a startup. So how I might phrase that as a question is, how do your experiences translate to skills that are valuable as at a startup? The third portion of the application is the video interview. And so you can think of this as your traditional interview questions, but just with a startup lens. Really an opportunity for us to dig into your background and get to know you better as a person. Some example questions might be about an obstacle that you've overcome so that we can consider how you would react to certain obstacles or challenges while working at a startup. And then lastly, our fourth step of the application process is selection day. This is an all-day in-person interview. There's group exercises as well as individual exercises. And as far as this webinar goes, should you apply to deadline 3, which is this Thursday, your selection day would be in New Orleans or Philadelphia in January. I'm going to thread a link here in the chat. Let me see if I can find the chat. It appears that I have lost the window. Where's the chat? Here we go. So I just threaded a link in the chat that has an overview of our application process. Like I shared, we have one deadline coming up this Thursday, and we have another one January the 31st. We can talk offline if you're confused about which deadline you should apply to, given that there's about 48 hours into our next deadline. And here's just an overview of our application process. You will see here that there's 4 steps to the application. The ones highlighted in red are the ones that are coming up for the November 21st deadline, but there's also January the 31st which would be our final deadline for the class of 2020. Cool. So what we look for. First is mission alignment. And so it's very important that you do your homework about VFA and our mission, which is why I read it at the beginning. I'd encourage you to read our website, dig into why we do the work that we do. But what's most important here is that you tell why VFA is the next best step in your career. We know that you can get a startup job on your own, but what is it specifically about VFA that will help you get to your career goals of being a leader at a startup and or a founder, which are the 2 outcomes that as an organization we support. The core components of our mission are that our fellows want to work at a for-profit startup in one of our cities with the goal of becoming a startup leader and or a founder. So make sure that you're focusing on those core components while telling your story so that we can learn how we can help you get to your career goals. And I encourage that as a model in all that you're applying to for your internships or jobs. Secondly is your ability to contribute. So I talked about a second essential question of being, how do your skills translate to how do your experiences translate to skills that are valuable at a startup? What we care about is, one, that you're a good fit for VFA and that you're going to be able to add value at a startup, which is why we ask you about that in the second round of the application. I always like to kind of give an example here as like a salesperson. So I didn't have any formal sales training going into my role, but like I had sold when I was a leader of a campus organization, recruiting people to join my organization. I did sell when I was a DJ, selling my services to clients. And so what I did was, like, I thought about the skills that were required for a sales position. In fact, I looked at some job descriptions for sales roles, and I looked under the skills required and made sure that I had a story that could demonstrate that I had that skill. Whenever possible, you really want to quantify your results, quantify your impact. For example, I could share the story that when I was in high school, I sent letters out to over 200 schools and high schools throughout the Columbus area when I was DJing. I followed up with those 200 people via phone. I got on the phone with 20 of them, and I ultimately ended up DJing at 5 of those events for X amount of revenue. Like those are the ways that you can quantify your thinking so that your employers, whether it's an internship or a job or Venture for America, can know that you think about your impact in a quantitative way and that you're measuring your work. And the last thing is character. You know, these are the things that are often hard to measure. Are you positive when things are gloom? Do you have stories from your life, professionally and personally, that demonstrate grit, integrity, resilience? You know, these are the kind of the intangibles that are very important when working at a startup. So let's jump into Match, how you're going to find your job. So the match process, we will not place you at a startup nor in a city, but we're going to help you. During Match, you are responsible for driving your own search. The great thing is that last year there were nearly 600 job opportunities for 200 fellows. This is going to begin in April of 2020 for those who joined the class of 2020. A couple of disclaimers about VFA. So we aren't a magic wand. If you say, like, I want a job in food and beverage in Detroit and I want a marketing role, first and foremost, that job may or may not exist and that company would have to hire you. And so we encourage you to think broadly about how you can achieve your career goals. Of course, it's important to think about industry, about location, about role, but we really push fellows to think about additional preferences that would be beneficial in their career. For example, finding a job every day where you can make an impact, finding a boss or a manager at your company that's going to treat you like a mentor or an apprentice. You know, finding a team where you can bring your full self to work every day and feel comfortable in your own skin. For those last 3 preferences that I listed, even if you were in your dream city, your dream role, and in your dream location, if you didn't have those 3 things, the job might not be as fulfilling. So we really push you on really developing your preferences just beyond industry, location, and role. And just so you know, like, Match is a time-intensive process, right? You take all this time to get into VFA. We onboard you in the spring of 2020 to get ready for Match in April. And from April to like the end of June, sometimes into July, this is a time-intensive process. So for those who are seniors, I've been a senior once. I know, you know, the kind of work-life balance that's important during one's senior year. But it's also important to realize that this is a time-intensive process that's going to determine where you're going to be working for at least the next 2 years. So to set that time aside. And like I said, we know that you can get a job anywhere, but what are the resources that we provide to fellows to help them get jobs? So first and foremost, we have Match, which you can think of as like a LinkedIn for incoming VFA fellows. All the fellows are going to create profiles. The companies will create profiles as well, and you all will pitch each other based on the opportunities that the companies post as well as your profile. We will coach you on your resume as well as your interview skills before launching in your Match search, right? We're going to interview you over the next 2 months if you apply to this deadline Thursday. And so we'll know a little bit about you to provide some feedback for you prior to launching your job search. We have job fairs throughout the spring. They're usually in about 2 to 3 different cities, and they're regionally organized. So last year we had a job fair in Cleveland, one in Baltimore, one in Birmingham. The startups from around that region, right, come to that city. So if we're focused on the Southeast and the fair is in Birmingham, our startups that we work with that are in San Antonio, Miami, New Orleans, Charlotte would travel to that job fair for you to do kind of like a speed dating networking style for your job, so you can meet a bunch of companies at once. This is also a great opportunity to get to know a VFA city and meet other fellows in your class as well as older fellows. And lastly, we will make direct introductions between you and companies. So once we know your preferences, when we find opportunities that fit those needs, we will make introductions to make this job easier both for you and the companies that we work with. And so I want to give like a little bit of an overview on the companies that we work with in Match. So as you'll see from this pie chart, the vast majority of our companies are for-profit businesses. About 10% are nonprofit, 5% are VCs, 1% are social enterprises, and the rest are about a mix of kind of hard to categorize organizations like co-working spaces and others. Um, the disclaimer here is that it's really important for you to be able to think about how working at a for-profit business will be the next best step in your career. I identify as a millennial, and I know one stereotype or characteristic of our generation is that we want our work to matter. We want to make an impact on society. We care about the social consequences of our employment. If you're interested in like the social enterprise space, the nonprofit space, please bring that up in our Q&A so that I can dig into kind of my 2 cents on that. Even if you're interested in those spaces, I have a good argument for you to work at a startup and to think about VFA. But throw that in the Q&A and we can dig a little bit deeper. You'll see about 5% of our companies that we work with are venture capital firms and incubators. If you are solely interested in venture capital, VFA is not the next best step for you, right? We're not in the business of creating venture capitalists, creating analysts. We're in the business of creating startup leaders and founders. We know that venture capital is a part of that journey, but like you see, there's only 5% of our jobs available in venture capital, so there are way more direct ways to get involved in the venture capital industry if that's something that you're interested in. Like I said, preferences for industry are encouraged to be broad. So if you're interested in venture capital, but you also have other interests, then VFA is a great fit for you. If you're solely interested on VC, I'd encourage you to think about if this is the most direct path to get there. And then as far as industries go, most of our jobs are in software and technology, education, the health space, food and beverage, as well as wellness. If you want to look at the companies that we work with, I'm threading a link in the chat feature to where fellows work. You can see a sample of all of the companies where fellows have worked in the past. That does not mean that these companies are going to be on Match the year that you apply to VFA. It's just to give you an idea on the types of companies we work with and the types of problems that they're solving in these 14 cities that we work with. In addition to the disclaimer about venture capital, you'll notice that we don't have a lot of necessarily engineering jobs as well as green technology jobs. In the cities that we work with, there just aren't that many opportunities. Like I said, there are a few. It tends to be that if somebody is going into like an engineering role at a startup, they look for a more senior level person. So if you're interested in engineering, please reach out to me during the Q&A so I can kind of give you my spiel on engineering and how I think you can leverage your experience into working at a startup. There's plenty of software engineering jobs, and there aren't that many green technology jobs. So just be considerate of that alongside venture capital and nonprofits. And like I mentioned, nearly 600 opportunities were on Match last year, and that grows year after year. So let's jump into training camp. So training camp, one thing that we focus on is skill development. And so you will really be exposed to things about a mile wide and an inch deep, so that on the first day of working at your startup, you've been exposed to a lot and at least can Google your way through any problem. So we have, industry experts like IDEO and Y Combinator come in and teach you on soft skill development as well as hard skill development. It's important for us throughout training camp to foster an entrepreneurial mindset. So each week there are challenges where you get together with fellows and tackle a certain challenge in the team atmosphere. And lastly, you really get to dig into your class as a community, and really learn about VFA's values. Um, of course, the soft and hard skill development, as well as the challenges, are the core to training camp. But speaking on behalf of fellows, I would assume that the most important thing for a lot of VFA fellows is getting to know the 200 other fellows that are in their class. I mean, these are your future roommates when you move to your cities, your future co-founders should you decide to start your own business, and most importantly, your friends in your community that are on this entrepreneurial journey with you. Awesome. And next is life as a VFA fellow as well as an alum. So let's dig into life during the fellowship. So training camp, I didn't mention, is in Detroit. It's in the month of July. We cover your food, we cover your housing. In August and September of next year, the class of 2020 will move to their cities. And the core of your fellowship is working at your startup, right? You have an opportunity for hands-on education, learning on someone else's dime. For me, in addition to performing my role as a salesperson and learning that skill set, I got to watch my company grow from 40 employees to 100 employees and see the strengths and weaknesses that the leaders at my company, uh, you know, presented when like managing this growth. And throughout the fellowship, there's opportunities for professional development as well as mentorship. Um, Training camp is like the first professional development opportunity that you have. But we have professional development workshops locally, regionally, and nationally based on things that you're interested in. You do come back together as a class, both 1 year after the start of your fellowship and 2 years as your fellowship comes to a close for some of these professional development opportunities. Furthermore, we have a mentorship portal that you have access to in the first year of your fellowship so that you can find mentors inside and outside of your city that are within the VFA network that you might share an interest in. And lastly, you really get to dig into a startup ecosystem and your community as a whole. Just from my experience as a fellow and an alum in New Orleans, I planned an entrepreneurship conference while I was a fellow. I mentored with an organization that worked with boys who had lost their dad to death or imprisonment. I played in intramural sports leagues to stay fit. And some of my peers even purchased homes. So just as important as developing on the job is also developing inside the job and getting to know which city you end up moving to. Cool. And let's talk about life after the fellowship. So, 13% of our alumni have gone on to start, are currently working on their own companies. 13% are. This is like Muksha Etalani, who launched Natural Club. She's in the class of 2014, which is my class. And she has even gone on to hire via younger VFA fellows to work at Natural Club. You should note that 30% of VFA alumni have started businesses with VFA, which means that some of these companies have not worked out, but they've tried and they're still going as individuals with their career. And so that's just to let you know that throughout VFA, whether it's immediately after your fellowship or as an alum, you have access to these resources because we know that the entrepreneurial journey is long, there's ups and downs, and that you may start a business immediately after your fellowship or sometime in the future as a VFA alum. So you have those opportunities for that programming for life. 60% of our alumni identify as a leader at the startup that they work at. Like Alex here, he started as a VFA fellow in 2013 and has been promoted year after year and now works as the CEO, as a COO at the startup that he works at in Detroit. And so, like I said, we have two paths at Venture for America. One is the founder path, like Muksha, and one is the startup leader path, like Alex. It's the hope that at the end of your fellowship, when we check in with you, that you identify as a startup leader. There's a lot of different ways that you could cut that. Of course, it might be in title, like Alex here being the COO, but perhaps it's in terms of you managing another employee and getting that experience, or leading a certain project on the marketing team or the software engineering team. Perhaps you've mastered a skill set or a couple of programs that allow you to be a more efficient employee on the operations team or the sales team. There's a lot of different milestones that a fellow might set for themselves to think about, hey, do I identify as a leader here by the time that my fellowship concludes? And lastly, some of our fellows have taken their skills to larger businesses and tech firms. Another example from the class of 2014 is Molly Adair, also in my class. After working at a furniture startup called Focal Upright Furniture in Providence, Rhode Island, Molly moved to Seattle and joined Amazon Web Services as a UX designer because she had a significant other that lived there that she wanted to live with. And so, as you can see, there's a lot of different routes that you can take as a VFA alum. I think what's most important to think about with this is that the entrepreneurial journey is long. And so many VFA fellows might touch on all three of these opportunities throughout their career. And VFA will support you no matter which route you choose to pursue. And the last thing I'm going to dig into before we move over to the Q&A is our launch resources. So these are resources related to you starting a company. And so when thinking about starting a company, we know that a fellow can be anywhere between A and Z with their business, right? So point A might be, hey, I've noticed a problem and I think I might have a solution to solve for that problem. We call that product market fit. Z might be the exit of your company several years from now. And so we can support you throughout that entire journey. A couple of programs to highlight. So we have quarterly hackathons where there's prize money at the end of the competitions. These hackathons are related to validating idea, like I said with point A, pitching to a virtual panel and then receiving money to accomplish the next objective in your journey. Program number 2 is our accelerator, which is one of our most highlighted programs. It's currently happening in Cleveland. They just had their final demo day in Cleveland last Friday, right after our selection day there. During the accelerator, we cover your food and your housing so that you can focus on achieving an objective with your business. And throughout the day and throughout the week of this 4-month experience, there's programming as well as mentorship for you to continue to learn about being a founder. The goal is that you accomplish one major objective during the accelerator. Perhaps this is finding your first customer, reaching a certain revenue goal, or getting into an accelerator like Techstars or Y Combinator that is for later stage startups. And then the last program that I'll highlight is that VFA actually invests in the startups of our fellows. So should you be raising a fundraising round and like to include VFA on that round, we invest up to $1.4 million each year in funding opportunities across direct investment grants and the various competitions and campaigns that we have for fellows. And like I mentioned, these resources are eligible to you during the fellowship, immediately after the fellowship, and as an alum for life. Awesome. So we're going to get into the Q&A, but I just want to dig into a couple of things before we answer questions. So I'm curious if you all got what you wanted out of today's webinar. When I follow up with the recording, I'm going to include a survey. So I'd love to receive your feedback on the webinar so we can continue to improve, as well as answer any questions that you have. I hope that you stay in touch, and here's my email address. It's the letter J, the letter R at ventureforamerica.com. No need to write it down. I'm going to follow up with you with the recording, as well as I sent you an email reminder this morning. And this is just a last reminder that we have our upcoming deadline on Thursday by midnight. I would say that the first step of the application generally takes about 1 hour to 3 hours, depending upon how much research you've done on VFA and the shape of your resume. But I would encourage folks, if you're a senior or a recent grad that's thinking about applying, to apply by this deadline, because you will receive your decision in late January, and then you have 2 months to onboard for match. So you'll get your offer in January. February, March will onboard you to take advantage of your resources as a fellow, as well as get ready for match. If you apply in January, you don't find out until March, and you only have a couple of weeks for onboarding, which is just a tighter turnaround, although doable. So I just encourage folks to apply to the earlier deadlines when possible, just so that you have enough time. I see some folks starting to use the chat, and we're getting into the Q&A. So feel free to thread your questions there. And as I see them come in, I'll try to group them so that we're answering, questions of a similar theme. And we've got 20 minutes remaining, so happy to be here for you all throughout that time. So we have a question here for people who graduated in April, May 2017. What should I be aware of when I am doing my application? Yeah, so you're on the older end of applicants. I would actually say that you're at a huge advantage. Just think about this, like you already have work experience, and so most of us, right, coming straight out of school, we have to figure out like how to be adults, pay bills at the same time, become a professional, and on top of it, like we're working at a startup, which is like a less structured environment. So as an older applicant in terms of school years, I think that you're actually at an advantage. Also, the older we are, we tend to have a better idea of what we want to do with our life, and so, or at least with the next couple of years. And so, I would expect that, that your application, you might be a little bit more confident than some of your peers that are younger, because you might know what you don't want to do based on your last couple of years of experience. But all in all, experience is wisdom, and I would encourage you with your application because you have that wisdom. Let me know if that answers your question. You're good to go as far as your eligibility. Tommy asked, on the opposite end of the spectrum, what you should do in the coming years to make yourself a better applicant when you're eligible. Yeah, great question. And I think this really goes for all applicants. It's just really thinking about times where you've made an impact. So no matter what you do, think about like measuring your impact, especially in a quantitative way, so that when you go into internships, when you go into jobs, you can really speak about a way that you've measured your impact in the past. Secondly, it's not necessarily important that you start a business while that you're in college, but think about opportunities to start something, right? If you see a problem on your campus, for example, a club that you're into that got defunct, or a problem in your community, try to solve for that problem. Starting something is often, there's often certain fundamentals that are applicable across the environments that you're working in. I'd also just encourage you to see if you can intern at a startup. I know a lot of us like to participate in extracurricular activities, and in college, I think I over participated in extracurricular activities. If I could go back, I'd intern at a startup, potentially during the semester, as well as during the summer. Startups can't always pay a lot, and I don't encourage people to take unpaid jobs, because I realize that people have different socioeconomic situations. And so think about opportunities like whether it's interning during the semester where your rent's already covered, as well as like during the summer, if you could like stay at home or crash on the couch, where you can intern and get some startup experience to know if this is a path that's really for you. Adrian asked a question about how startups are vetted for match. If your placement was to fail and close, do fellows have a backup job in job security? Yeah, great question. So we like to say that our companies are sourced. They're not necessarily vetted. The reason for this is, VFA, the value that we add to these companies is that we are helping them find employees that are go-getters. So these companies don't turn over their financial documents to us for us to vet them in that way. That being said, a couple of ways that we do, a couple of characteristics that we look for in these startups. So first and foremost, we live in these cities. And so as a member of the Columbus startup community, as a member of the New Orleans startup community when I lived there, first and foremost, you know the companies that are growing the fastest. And so that's like a great first place to start. Like, could this place be a good place for a fellow? We also know the reputations of the founders and the leaders of these organizations, right? So in the tech and entrepreneurial space, we've all heard stories about leaders that are friendly and have an environment where people can bring their full selves to work. And we've also heard stories about some of the leaders at the highest tech firms in the nation that are douchebags. And so by living and working in these entrepreneurial communities, we know the reputations of these leaders and would not send a fellow to a employer where their leadership was poor in reputation. But from there, right, startups can still go down. We interview these startups on their, their runway, their funding, the expectations for them as a manager of a VFA fellow, right? Are they signing on to being, to teaching you your role, but also pulling back the curtain a little bit and treating you like an apprentice so that you can learn to, start a business. I'll share from personal experience. So about 20 months into my fellowship, my company actually went under. Um, Now I share this like not to scare you all, but to like keep it real because like Adrian shared, like startups do close and that's the nature of this business. So a couple things to keep in mind. Um, First and foremost, knowing what I know now, even if I knew the startup was going to go under, I'd still take that job all over again because I learned um, what to do as well as what not to do. And so I talked about seeing that startup grow from 40 employees to 100 employees, right? Before we closed down, we went back down to 40 employees. I saw that company grow from 10 cities to 31 cities, right? So I saw that company raise over $10 million through our Series A round. So I can give you 10 lessons on what we did to get there, but I can give you 20 or 30 lessons on what we did wrong. And should you want to lead at a startup, should you want to build a company one day, it's often more important what not to do than what to do. And so that was a priceless learning experience. Let's talk about like the financial side of that as well as like what VFA did. Um, so thankfully I had money saved, which I think is is very important to think about. With launching all of your careers is like getting into a habit of saving money for a raining day as well as for long term. So thankfully I had money saved. The day that Dinner Lab, which was the startup that I worked at, went down, VFA was one of the first people to reach out to me, right? It was in the news. And VFA reached out to me. We reached out to VFA to let them know that it happened. The first thing they asked HQ was like, are you okay? Like, do you have the resources that you need to pay your bills? Are you all right? Do you need help finding a job? I had saved enough where like I had a little bit of a cushion. So I wanted to take a little bit of a break. But as I networked around the city and around my community, this is why I really knew I was in the right place. So I was talking with leaders at startups around New Orleans. And like the number one thing that people said to me was, don't leave New Orleans. Right. And that kind of gets at VFA's mission. Like it means something when you all decide to move to Cleveland or Kansas City, Miami or San Antonio, Baltimore. Like you are going to make an impact at that startup. You are going to make an impact in that community. And VFA is doing its part to make that economic impact. And that's what these startup leaders were saying. Like, don't go move to a big city. Like, find an opportunity here. That's the next best step in your career. Um, People came out the woodwork to like get me jobs. Not only VFA, not only these startup leaders that I was networking with, but also other VFA fellows. Two VFA fellows like hooked me up with like part-time gigs where I could make like $1,000, $2,000 over a couple of weeks, just to kind of maintain my savings as I went around for job interviews. And I ultimately decided to stay in New Orleans. So I hope that like really encourages you all that like although this is a risk, this is a safe risk. That VFA will have your back both locally and nationally. These communities will have your back. And of course, there's some financial management that is, that is important for like these rainy days when it can happen. But if you want to become a leader at a startup and or a founder, this is one of the most direct ways to get there. Um, so I know that was a little bit of a long win, but like that was a little bit of my story, and I wanted to keep it real with y'all. Um, I believe you pronounced your name Sheila. I apologize if I mispronounced it. That you shared that you have an interest in starting a search fund, like a small private equity or venture capital firm down the line. But you're very much open to working at a startup that is aligned with your other interests and can help you learn a new skill. You'd like to know of any companies in the finance space that VFA works with, if any. Yeah, so I threaded a link here where fellows work. And when you go to that link, you could click on you can filter these companies by industry. And so I'd encourage you to explore that based on all of the industries that you're interested in, as well as city and company size, so that you can see companies in the space that you work in. Like I said, though, that's like a sample of the companies that we've worked with in the past. It wouldn't be guaranteed that those exact same companies would be on match in hiring this year, but I think it'll give you an idea of who we work with. Um, I like what Sheila said in her question about working with a startup that aligns with her other interests. I think it's something that's like really important to think about, y'all. Is like as a young person, we often do not know what we don't know. And so when you get into the startup world, like your world is going to expand a little bit. And if you are interested in like starting a business and building a business, it does not necessarily have to be the case that it is in the industry that you are interested in, that you work in, right? If you go and work at a startup that's growing quickly, where there's mentorship, where you can be yourself and you learn the fundamentals of working in startups, you develop your other interests, you get kind of the fundamentals down of being a working professional, then it's quite easier to jump into an industry of choice because you have a lot of the fundamentals down. So I just want to encourage you all to be broad with your job searches. Bryce asked, he said he has a product idea. Do I have any advice in terms of getting it on the market? We have this book called Everything Startups. If you go to the VFA website and you search Everything Startups, there is a couple dozen page book on everything that we know about startups after helping about 1,000 people launch their careers as startup entrepreneurial leaders. And I'll include that in the follow-up for you, Bryce, so you don't have to search for that. Sierra asked about fashion merchandising and design. Yeah, Sierra, same advice to Sheila. Search the website where fellows work based on your industry of choice. I would also say that there are a couple of fellows who have started companies in the fashion space. One that comes to mind is Diop, D-I-O-P. It's a heritage-inspired clothing line, as well as Ash and Erie, which they have clothing for shorter guys. I think it's about folks that are about 5'6" or below. Two short VFA fellows that really leverage their identity to start a business and solve a problem for people within their community. And they're one of my favorite stories because I like talking about folks who think about problems that they're facing, especially identity-based problems, and look to solve those problems. Ethan asked, for STEM students, beyond teaching the entrepreneurial mindset, will you train financial and operational practices? Yeah, so I kind of mentioned learning a little bit about a lot. There's going to be like an introduction to sales, an introduction to Excel, an introduction to some software engineering, operations, really like every role that you can have at a startup, marketing, social media. And a lot of times when we have those introductions, we'll also have an advanced course. So if like you're already proficient in Excel, right, giving you some advanced shortcuts and techniques to start cutting down on time in the advanced section. So those are kind of like our hard skill workshops. And the idea is like, yeah, perhaps you're going into a software engineering role, so you might not think that you need to know sales, operations, or marketing, but often you'll be working with those teams. Um, Often, if you end up starting a business of your own, you'll want to know a little bit about those things. So there's a plethora of workshops that we give you both on the soft skill side and the hard skill side. Kiki asked, would you be able to connect me with a VFA fellow who studied the same college that I did? Kiki, actually, what I'd recommend is that you go to the VFA website, and this is a recommendation for all of you all. You can go to the Fellow Network, and just like I was recommending that folks explore the companies by industry, you can explore the fellows by school. Um, you can then reach out to them on LinkedIn. Um, I would recommend that you ask for 20 minutes, 30 minutes of their time, or ask them a couple of questions virtually. Say, for example, you go to a college where there has not been a fellow before, then I would recommend that you reach out to a fellow who was the first from their school. How might you find that? Look for a school that you have never heard of before and click on that school and see how many fellows have come from that school, and like ask them like, hey, how did you become the first, right? I think you might share that in common, and they would be very encouraging to somebody else who was going to be the first fellow from their school. And we say like the best way to become a fellow is to know a fellow, and I don't think that's very fair to fellows who don't have folks who have come from their school. But I think what I really encourage y'all to do as applicants is to get into a habit of networking with people and asking for a little bit of their time, so that you can get to where you want to go. It's pivotal as VFA fellows and to launch your career. um, yeah, this is a good question from B. Sydney. She said, measuring an impact. This can be hard, even though I have been working for the past 2 years. There is no big impact, but there are small accomplishments when contributing back to the company I have worked for, but they are more like fulfilling the job duties. Can you describe more about the quantification of impact? Great question. Um, so I think the important ways to think about this are a couple. This could be like in the form of like a project that you've completed and what the company or the organization was able to do based on that accomplishment. So like perhaps you are a piece of the operation. And so if you're not in a sales role or you're not in a marketing role, like sometimes these things can be harder to quantify. But it's a good thing to kind of talk to your manager or your peers about, like, what is the impact of my work. And so I'd be curious, like, um, based on the projects that you've worked on, like the amount of revenue that your organization has been able to pull in, the amount of people you've been able to hire, the time saved by this project that you were able to execute, any percentage increases in the efficiency of your work. At times, I know that this can be hard to do, right? There's some of us that are in quantitative roles, sales, marketing, recruiting, HR. Others are internal, and so yeah, I'd encourage you that to talk to your peers, talk to your manager, and frame it possibly in terms of like professional development. Like, hey, you want to make sure that you're measuring your impact to make sure that you're making an impact. But also, like, it's okay to make projections, right? Like, I know some folks have part-time jobs. Let's say that you're a cashier. Make a projection on like the number of people that you check out per day and the amount of revenue that you're able to generate as a cashier, right? Like when you start to think about your work in these ways, it's helpful for employers to say like, okay, person X was a cashier and it was a customer service job, right? Although it was a part-time job, they're pumped up and confident about this experience. And they've talked to me about how they were able to generate X amount of money as a cashier, engaging with Y number of customers per day. I realize that when they come to my role and they're in a customer service role, they're going to think about the amount of revenue they're generating the organization, the number of customers that they're serving, and be in a customer service mindset. That's kind of how it like translates internally. Another way to kind of think about like quantifying impact, like say for example, you're a developer or you've learned certain programs, right? Those are other ways to demonstrate that you're proficient based on the languages or the programs that you know. Um, excuse me, in your role. Feel free to follow up. I know we're coming up on time, but I will follow up on that one because that's an important one. Um, the second to last one, as we come up on 60 minutes, is from Lyric. Lyric shared that they are a junior, an English major, recently spoke with their advisor who told them about the CEO of YouTube and how he has a degree in English. Is it common to go a non-traditional route when graduating? I think it depends on the person, right? Like I studied public policy, thought about becoming a teacher, ended up in startups. Um, I'd say that, what we study in school is to train us to think. It's to train us to problem solve. And I actually think that people with non-traditional backgrounds might have an advantage in like really being able to tell a unique story about why something is the next best step in their career. Like if you study sales and you go into sales, that's not always the most the easiest thing to remember, but like the English major that becomes a salesperson and tells their story about why they're interested in sales. Excuse me, y'all. I think it forces you to kind of dig a little deep in your story. And so, I mean, I just encourage you to think about the skills that you're gaining in the classroom, as well as outside the classroom and your extracurricular activities, because they're all applicable to the startup and professional world. I know we're coming up on time. I'm also losing my voice or something's caught in my throat. Um, so if you have questions, please follow up with me via email. I will be sending out a recording of the webinar no later than tomorrow, and appreciate y'all's time. I am going to finish this last question that just came in here, and then we'll sign off. From B. Sydney, for people who have different skill sets, in other words, sales, marketing, IT, are they able to take on different responsibilities in an organization and love to learn on the spot when applying to VFA? What should the individual focus on so the employer does not feel like you have too many skill sets, which can become a bad thing, question mark. Yeah, I feel that. So, a startup is going to hire you to do one thing primarily, and then you're going to wear a whole bunch of other hats. So like as a salesperson at the startup that I worked at, like, of course I was selling, but there were often times where I was developing processes with the operations teams, where I was working functionally with the customer service team to make sure that we were fulfilling the needs of our customers. I was sharing technical problems with the finance team and with the software engineering team to build out solutions for those problems. So I think the biggest challenge that I've personally faced is sticking to my individual role. Like I love to like work cross-functionally, but what's most important is that you execute the role that they hire you for, because you might be the only person doing it, or you might be one of few, and like that's how they're expecting you to add value. And so I think it's mature to say, hey, this is the primary role that I'm looking for, but I also have secondary experience in these roles. But you want to focus on the experiences that you have that translate to the skills that that are required in the role that you're applying for. I often like to use the comparison of sports. Right? So like when it comes to basketball, usually people are right-handed or left-handed. If it's the game-winning shot, you want to shoot with your dominant hand. Same thing kind of goes with this. Like you're looking for a job, like pick your most dominant role. But you know that if you have to, like you can use the other hand, like you go to the other roles. But like focus on the area where you can add the most value. So I appreciate y'all hanging around, for you taking the time to learn about Venture for America, for you staying on a little bit late. Like I said, happy to be a resource for y'all throughout your journey. If you're an underclassman, we'll be focused on engaging you in February, starting in February, March of next year. So please focus, your outreach around that time of year. For those who are thinking about applying to VFA, it's all about you all right now. So happy to be a resource for you as you begin or continue in the application process. Let me know how I can help, and I appreciate y'all's time. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Y'all have a great one.